think my first take on that question is the very idea of perspectives, which are always already regional, right? When we think of the perspective from Europe or North America, the North Atlantic worlds more broadly, it is a perspective that comes out of a very particular history of North Atlantic art. And this perspective cannot, and we've repeatedly seen this, cannot really be expanded fruitfully to speak of other parts of the world. I think we have to step back also and complicate the regional. What exactly does the regional mean? How does the national fit within the regional? And what are the contentions that emerge within the two? Speaking from an Indian perspective, we know that there has been a very consistent point of tension between what constitutes the Indian national and what constitutes the regional modern. And these are not necessarily the same things. Standing in 2017, thinking about the region and thinking about the world, I think it's become more and more important to actually step back and forget, or rather unlearn, everything that we've learned, not just from North Atlantic art history, but also from South Asian art history, to step back and to put things together once again in a way that begins to make a little bit more sense than it so far has. So I wouldn't say that we give up on the canon, but I would certainly insist that we at least start to put things together in an entirely different way. Personally, I'm somewhat wary of thinking in terms of seismic moments, because when we begin to identify a movement as of optimum importance within a region or within the world or within the globe, what have you, we are already predetermined to set up certain pivotal points around which we organize another narrative. I think it may be far more fruitful to start thinking in terms of networks, nodes, points of contact, intersections. When we begin to think outside of a linear trajectory, then we begin to get many seismic movements, right? And we might even begin to see how they cluster around other movements that transpire in other parts of the world. So my own interest is really to think away from high points, look away from seismic moments, really. Well, if you think about contemporary art in South Asia, we begin to see a certain kind of engagement with many historical moments. There is the colonial history, which artists continually and repeatedly re-engage. But there's also the history of national liberation, which produced its own kind of effusive narratives, which began to crumble very quickly, as it always does in most decolonizing contexts, within the first decade of decolonization. But I think contemporary art has moved very far from this kind of linearity. I don't think artists are turning to any specific movement or moment, but they're really reordering history, reimagining what the past may have looked like from a perspective of the present. In the recent past, we seem to have connected the idea of the global very concretely to globalization. Yet the global is it existed prior to globalization. And I'm thinking very specifically of the non-aligned movement, which came together in 1955, consolidated itself in 61, a movement of 30 newly decolonized countries which didn't subscribe to the Cold War polarity. So while non-alignment was a relationship between nations, for artists and intellectuals, it was an ideological movement. It was an intellectual movement, a kind of position in the world that was a third alternative to what already existed. But within that network, a certain other idea of the global emerges. So I'm somewhat partial to thinking in terms of the global rather than the international, because I feel that the notion of the global, taken in this sense of non-alignment, taken in this sense of a transaction within the globe, retains the sense of hierarchy from which the idea of the global comes out. But this is an idea of a different global. This is not the global of globalization. International doesn't quite have that same purchase, at least as far as I'm concerned. I wouldn't say it's a prerequisite necessarily, but it is also true that as the region has emerged into globalization, there has been a more intense engagement with its particularities, or rather the particularities of its art production. And this has, within the region, it has played out in very specific terms. For example, in the recent past, we can see several new museums come up in India. But these have happened precisely after a certain moment of globalization. So I wouldn't say it's a prerequisite, but it has certainly complicated our understanding of art produced in South Asia.